Should I start?
Yeah.
Okay.
Introduce the
Great. Okay. Then I'm going to start screen sharing. Okay. Awesome. Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Caitlin. I am the Civic Engagement Coordinator here at the Korean Resource Center, and I'm going to be presenting on educational racism. And this is the introduction to our California Dream Act workshop event, which is presented by KRC, and it is in collaboration with our Voices for Tomorrow internship. So just a disclaimer, this is a very basic overview. We're just going to be sort of touching on systematic racism as it presents itself in education, but this is a very vast and complicated topic, and I don't think this presentation necessarily does it sufficient justice, so please keep that in mind. So some history and background. So records of institutional racism actually date back to as early as the 1800s in the United States. One of the earliest instances of this is with Native American children who were actually forcibly removed from their homes and made to attend boarding schools that were established and facilitated by Europeans. These students were forced to adopt foreign languages and religion and made to abandon their own languages and religions. This was one of the foundations of white supremacy and white superiority complex. Some other examples presented themselves in Chinese American children who were banned from attending school. Later on, legislation did assert Chinese American children's rights to public education, but students were segregated into Chinese-only schools. Different Latinx communities were likewise methodically banned from education, and luckily they were later granted access by the ruling of a judge. However, this was done on the basis that Latinx folks were of white descent. In the South, most notoriously in United States history, the law completely obstructed African Americans from educational access. It was actually illegal to learn how to read and write for African Americans. Illiteracy was actually weaponized against African Americans because slave owners and people of the time, white folks of the time, believed that illiteracy meant that African Americans who were enslaved could not rise up against their white masters. And so they actually abused illiteracy in order to prevent a potential uprising. Notoriously, Jim Crow laws in the late 1800s emphasized this idea of separate but equal. They really espoused and advocated for segregated schools, which were under constant threat and opposition. And of course, we have the most notable case of Brown versus the Board of Education. So now, as we're moving into the 21st century, we see a rise of what is known as new racism in the education system. So racism nowadays obviously is perhaps less prominent, less openly malicious, and less openly reprehensible than more antiquated notions of racism. So we have outlawed slavery in the United States. We don't have segregation and things like that. However, in modern times, there are more subtle instances of racism, particularly in education. And because racism is so deeply ingrained in the United States consciousness, it's very easy for the mass population to dismiss more subtle instances of racism because they compare it to these more severe and more obvious notions of racism and are able to accept the idea that racism, it doesn't even exist. A lot of people who fall in this category, many people blame this lack of success of students of color, and they impose this upon lazy or uninvolved parents. This is a common notion in the education system and a common way that racism presents itself in the education system. People blame parents as being lazy or uninvolved in their children's education, and that is why students of color are lacking success or ambition. In this, the attention and culpability is shifted away from the detrimental policies and structures that are inherently disadvantageous for BIPOC students and shifts that blame to their parents. And as a result, families often feel pressured to alter their whole lifestyles and even relocate in order to have better access to education for their children. Students of color often find themselves as minorities in predominantly white schools, and this ends up compromising their senses of belonging and security and imposes a lot of undue pressure and restrictions. And these restrictions and denial to education perpetuate a culture that demeans BIPOC students and their communities. So these are just some statistics that demonstrate, yes, racism is unfortunately alive and well and thriving in our education system. The United States K through 12 school funding systems disproportionately shortchange and financially neglect BIPOC students. This is a proven fact. Over 35% of public school revenue comes from property taxes that actually favor wealthier communities, while others must rely on state revenues, which are unpredictable and often unreliable. Predominantly white school districts receive 23 million more per year than their predominantly BIPOC counterpart districts. Many BIPOC students end up attending schools that are statistically lacking in resources and are more outdated and sometimes even hazardous. And of course, in recent years, due to serious economic recession, many states have significantly cut funding to education, which has severely affected low income districts. And in more recent years, we haven't seen a restoration of these budgets. And most recently, in the wake of COVID, states are once again looking at massive budget hits to education. And of course, these are going to be skewed towards predominantly BIPOC school districts. And speaking to higher education as well, beyond K through 12, it is an unfortunate but undeniable fact that universities and colleges play a role in perpetuating structural racism and also subject students and staff of color to unwelcoming academic cultures. Frankly speaking, universities are not equitable or level playing fields. Students do not have equal opportunities to success. BIPOC students face obstacles such as misuse of standardized tests, as well as unique challenges that present themselves as they're transitioning into college. Many schools end up imposing a false and toxic culture of excellence that deeply affects BIPOC students, their mental and physical well being. And BIPOC faculty are disadvantaged through such injustices as inequitable distribution of grants and compromised tenure and promotion practices. So, what are some ways we can counteract this nonsense? What are some ways that we can actually fight back and bring some meaningful change? It's important because systemic racism in education is a foundational cause of many other inequities that BIPOC experience. So it is so important that we advocate for change in these inherently detrimental institutions. So advocating for proper allocation of federal funds to education purposes and to offset revenue shortfalls. So ensuring that different government entities are actually channeling funds properly in proper amounts to the proper channels to where they need to go, and also to actively counteract different shortages and cuts. And we can call for increased investments in education, as well as more equitable and transparent funding policies at local and state levels to ensure equity of spending in primarily BIPOC districts. So the United States of America spends so much of its money on the military, and so much of that money could be going to well-deserved places, such as education. So it's important for us to call for increased investments in the places that it matters, like education. And it is also important for us to ensure that funding is being distributed in a way that is equitable, in a way that is just, not just to wealthy white districts, but to our BIPOC districts as well. So organizations such as KRC are kind of championing this movement. We are continuing the fight to mitigate issues that are perpetuated by institutional racism. And we are doing this through sharing our resources and our experience, which in turn combats the oppressive forces that are imposed by ignorance, and we're countering it with knowledge and education. So we have a quick video for you today, and it has to do with racism and prejudices that are imposed in the higher education system.
Public college used to mean free college. Free college. So even in 1999, there was basically no student debt. Today, there's 1.7 trillion. What the happened? In the 1960s, protests spread across college campuses against the Vietnam War, for free speech, the Brown Berets, the Black Panthers, feminist movements. In the wake of these uprisings, this guy, governor of California, said that for the first time, the University of California should charge tuition. He actually said, "Those there to agitate might think twice how much they want to pay to carry a picket sign." In other words, when Black and brown folks demanded access to public colleges as places where you could study Chicanx history or denounce imperialist wars or build student power, Reagan said, "Oh yeah? Then pay for it." This is what happens when education is a privilege, not a right. Let me say it again. Public college used to be free. It should be again, and it can be again. We need to abolish student debt and bring back free college, but this time for all. Public college used to mean...
Do we need a conclusion here? Yes, okay. Sorry, Janetta, this is gonna be an edited video, so we're just kind of doing whatever. Okay, so thank you all for attending our meeting today. So we are actually going to go into our workshop, but as a closing statement, we ask that you use the knowledge that you gained today to feel empowered, to fight for equity in the education system. This workshop is just one of the ways that KRC is trying to fight the good fight in promoting equitable education accessibility. So thank you all for attending. Good luck. We'll see you all soon.